In 1947, a Bedouin goatsherd discovered a clay jar full of ancient scrolls by the Dead Sea in Israel. When these scrolls made it into the hands of antiquities dealers, it became clear that they had been written 2,000 years ago, around the same time Jesus walked the earth, and some of them were even older. Today, the Dead Sea Scrolls are some of the best examples we have of Second Temple Jewish literature. Our guest today is Dr. Rebekah Haigh, and she's here to tell us how the Dead Sea Scrolls revolutionized New Testament interpretation. You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Create a free account at ffoz.org to start exploring the Jewish foundation of your faith and receive a free book from our store.
Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
Well, all the way from Iowa, is that right? We have Dr. Rebekah Haigh. Welcome to Messiah Podcast.
It's great to be on.
Now, Iowa is famous for its corn population, but people don't know
for its corn.
that Michigan is also famously mostly corn at certain times of the year. At least the bottom part here, we got corn everywhere, and you know this because you're from here, aren't you?
Yep, I'm from Michigan originally. We do have a lot of corn. We also have a lot of other things to sort of break up the corn fields. It feels like in Iowa, you just drive through endless miles of corn. So there is more corn than in Michigan for sure.
Wow, they beat us. They got more corn.
Yeah, we could come up with in Michigan, we can be like, well, what else do you have besides corn? And we could be like great breweries, excellent cherry trees, lakes. And their answer is just corn.
Yeah. You get to the edge of the corn and there's more corn. So I feel like I briefly met you maybe 15 years ago or something like that. And at the time you were leveraging your prodigious intellect in the preservation of the poodle gene pool? Does that sound about right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I was as a young teenager, young 20-something, I was an aspiring AKC dog breeder, and I was in the dog shows and that kind of thing. But I learned pretty quickly you can't have multiple time-intensive hobbies. So it was between dogs and doing that on the weekends or doing the academic thing, which is also incredibly time consuming. So I chose the academic hobby, which is
wow. Well, not a hobby anymore. What got you interested? I think what I've been told is that you know a lot about the Dead Sea Scrolls. How did that become a particular area of interest for you?
Well, I blame my father and grandfather for this. Both of them had a deep and abiding love for museums. So they took me to a lot of museums as a child. And actually, I think it might have been in Grand Rapids. My memory is a bit fuzzy, but there was a traveling exhibit of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this was when they still were doing traveling exhibits. They don't really do them anymore because the scrolls are beginning to deteriorate. And there's a lot of international issues, right? But this was a traveling exhibit of the scrolls. And I just remember as a kid, I think I was like 11 or 12, just standing in front of one of these exhibits and looking at one of the scrolls and being like, wow, who gets to like do stuff with these? Because that would be cool.
Yeah.
And then when I was in college taking classes, I was just constantly drawn back to the scrolls, the mystery of them, who wrote them, why, what do they mean? That was the beginning of constantly thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls for the next 2 decades.
Wow. And we're going to ask you all those questions now that you were inspired by that.
I'm ready.
Yeah. Now you found out.
Now I found out all the answers I could ever want.
You went to, was it Princeton? Is that where you went?
Yeah, so I went to Princeton for my
That's
for my
one of the big
PhD.
ones.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, before that I was at Emory. I worked with Carol Newsom, who was she was assigned a collection of texts called the Shirot, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. I had read her commentary on them in my early 20s and was really fascinated by this collection of prayers that were prayed on the Sabbath by this community at Qumran. And so I went to work with her and learn more about, early Jewish prayers, right? Because this is some of our earliest evidence for liturgical prayer in Judaism.
Oh, cool.
And then I went to Princeton to sort of broaden the things that I was thinking about, think more about ancient Judaism and early Christianity and their intersection in the ancient Mediterranean world, the time period with the Romans. So Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient Near East, time of the New Testament, they're all of interest now to me.
Yeah. And I think, that's what makes the Dead Sea Scrolls interesting to us here at First Church of Zion, because it is, we suddenly had a Second Temple Jewish source that was like different. So for the uninitiated, or for those who maybe just have read a Dan Brown novel, don't actually know what these things are, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Like let's maybe do this narratively, because I like stories. Maybe you can tell us how we found them. Tell us about this whole epic story of the discovery of these new scrolls, or not new scrolls, but new to us.
Yeah. So the story that usually gets told goes something like this. There was a Bedouin young man wandering around the Dead Sea region. So this is the area around northwest of the Dead Sea. There's a bunch of caves that are along the whole coastline from up at the top of the sea all the way to the bottom where we find Masada. So he's wandering up this northwest part of the Dead Sea. He loses a goat. He's looking for a goat, and he sees some caves, and he's like, oh, you know what I should do? I should throw a stone in this cave, because that's what you do when you're looking for a goat, I guess. He throws a stone in the cave. He hears something.
Hoping to hit the goat and elicit a sound.
He didn't hit the goat. He hit a jar. He hit a jar and was like, what was that? And he climbs up and goes into this cave, and he finds a collection of jars and a collection of ancient fragments. So he smuggles some of these to a local antiquities dealer, and they're like, well, what are we dealing with here? And this is 1947, so not an inauspicious moment for the scrolls to be discovered. This is right before the British leave, right, Palestine, and before we have Israel as Israel becomes a nation, right? So this is right on the eve of that. So he smuggles
the timing is like crazy.
Yes. And indeed, the scrolls came to be seen by Israelis as sort of this symbol of returning back to their roots, right? And I can talk more about why the scrolls are so significant just for their content, but as just a material object, right, that stretches back several thousand years, written by first century BCE and first century CE Jews right before the fall of the Second Temple, right? This became a really important national icon.
Yeah.
But anyway, returning back to our Bedouin. So this Bedouin, he smuggles these scrolls to an antiquity dealer, and they look for experts to sort of like, oh, what are we dealing with? Eventually, the scrolls, this initial collection of 7 scrolls, gets split up. Half goes to an Israeli scholar, Sukenik, who has some of these, and the other half goes to the Syrian archbishop, who has some of these scrolls. And they're both trying to verify, like, what are we dealing with, right? Some of the early people who are writing accounts of how they felt when they read these scrolls were like, I found these scrolls and there's this ancient Hebrew hand, and I realized this isn't a forgery. This isn't modern Hebrew. This is a super, super ancient text. And I was just breathless with the possibilities of this, right? And I think this sort of wonder is why the scrolls have still continued to capture even just public imagination about the scrolls. For the next 100 years, you would often see like headlines that relate to the scrolls because people were just so interested in these ancient documents. So among the first 7 scrolls that were discovered, these big scrolls, we have a complete copy of Isaiah, the great Isaiah scroll as it is known. So we have every chapter of Isaiah is there, and it's a pretty long scroll. And it's still oftentimes not always, but you can find it in the Shrine of the Book on display. And some other cool texts that we found. So we found a copy of this biblical text, right? And before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest copy, well, Our oldest papyrus, we have a papyrus called the Nash Papyrus that was found shortly before that, a few decades before the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a copy of some lines of the Ten Commandments. And that was pretty old, right? But other than that, the oldest copies we have of biblical Hebrew manuscripts were stuff from the Masoretes, right? Which is written in the medieval period, right?
Yeah.
Almost 1,000 years after the turn of the Common Era, after 1,000 years after the time of Jesus, right? So the Dead Sea Scrolls were written way before the turn of the Common Era. So they were an incredible find and an incredible witness to the stability of the biblical text in many ways, but also not just the stability of the biblical text, but also the varieties of ancient Judaism that there were before the time of Jesus, right? And so it sort of broadened our picture of what ancient Judaism looked like, what kind of text they were reading, what kind of ideas that they were having, what they were doing, what were their ritual practices. All of this was a big blank slate for us. In fact, you could argue that before the Dead Sea Scrolls, really the only information we had about early Judaism was the New Testament. And of course, most people would not have made that case, right? Because they didn't think of the New Testament as Jewish literature.
Right.
But the rabbis are writing in late antiquity, hundreds of years after the turn of the Common Era. So other than the New Testament, it was just a blank slate. We didn't know what people were thinking, what they were doing. And the Dead Sea Scrolls help us complete that picture.
Wow. Now, as the little girl said in Jurassic Park, what happened to the goat?
Nobody knows. The goat is the unsung hero of the story, and no one cares what happened to the goat, right?
Eaten by dinosaur.
I say this is the story that's told because this is a story that you will find in any textbook that gives you an introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls. There has been some is that really what happened? Perhaps this Bedouin was actually going in search of artifacts. We actually don't know. So maybe there was no goat. Maybe there was no stone. But this is the story that gets told. So who's to say?
Yeah. Yeah, stories that end up shaping our lives and identities, and then you poke at them a little bit, and wait, is that what happened?
Is that what happened?
But without the stories, who are we? You know,
right?
Who are we? How do we know? How do we know who we are? It's worth thinking about the significance of having ancient Hebrew texts in Israel, especially now, where there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, these people have just got there, like the Jews just arrived there, and really the indigenous people are the Palestinians." Like, well, there were Jews, you know, like we have archaeological evidence of this Jewish population. It's not, that story is true.
Yeah. No, these are ancient Hebrew and ancient Aramaic manuscripts, almost 1,000 of them, and they weren't all written by, which we can talk more about the community that wrote the scrolls if you want. They weren't all written by this Qumran or Essene sect. Some of these texts are actually much older than the Qumran Essene texts. We have texts that date to, maybe the 3rd century BCE, 100, 200 years, perhaps, depending on how you date the community, before they started living at Khirbet Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea and writing their sectarian texts. We have things like the Book of Enoch, right? We have fragments of the Book of Enoch that were written probably in the 3rd century BCE. So clearly these were texts that were brought in, collected into this ancient library that reflect, Judaism, reflect other communities of Jewish practice and the texts that they liked, living outside of Qumran. So yes, we have, evidence of Jewish life, Jewish thought, the emergence of something called Judaism, which this is what's happening in the Second Temple period, right? This is our smoking gun for it in many ways.
Wow. Yeah, so and to have these primary sources, because we had Josephus. Josephus said a few words about a few different expressions of Judaism in his time. Yeah. And it's just not too much information, but a little bit. But he's like a secondary source, right? I mean, he's a great source. The thing about Josephus, and the thing about a lot of Josephus, pseudepigraphical sources, apocryphal sources like Philo, who was another known source about Second Temple Judaism before the Dead Sea Scrolls, is there's this really strange thing about these manuscripts, which is that
we only have them because of Christians. So the Josephus and Philo were of interest to later Christian theologians. And so their scribes continued to translate, transmit, and preserve these texts because they liked them, right? And so because of that process, scholars will have a lot of questions like, oh, is this Josephus who said this thing? Or is it a later Christian scribe who is inserting this thing because it is theologically nice and convenient for them and they like the sound of it, right? So there is some questions like what's authentic Philo, what's authentic Josephus. So there is this. Although for the most part, we trust most of what is now in the corpus of Philo and Josephus. Scholars will quibble over a couple of things. But there are other texts like that, right? That we only knew either we'd heard of or we knew because, thousands of years of Christian tradition had talked about them, but we didn't actually have the text. We couldn't verify, did these texts exist? Were they Jewish texts, right? Like the Book of Enoch, for instance. There was an Ethiopic copy of Enoch, right? We didn't have the Hebrew. We didn't have the Aramaic copies of these texts, right? Things like, Ben Sirach, right, which is included. It's an apocryphal text, right? This is a text that became really important to later Christian traditions, and it was included in some of their sacred literature. But we didn't have the Hebrew of Ben Sirach, right? And we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have these ancient fragments of this text. So, yes, this story that so many ancient Jewish texts were lost because Christians did not find them of interest and didn't transmit them. Or there were texts that they did find of interest and they did transmit, but we also have to ask questions of like which bits are Christian and which bits reflect a Jewish text. And there's lots of texts that fall under this category. And then we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a lot of those texts we find Hebrew and Aramaic fragments of them. So very, very cool for that reason.
When I think about the people who did this, all I can think about was it Christopher Guest, his character, talking about Stonehenge. No one knows who they were or what they were doing. Like who? Yeah. So I feel like what do we know, or what is commonly accepted as pretty good speculation as to who were the people who collected the earlier documents and wrote the later documents, and what were they doing out there by the Dead Sea?
Yeah, what were they doing is a question that really interested scholars, especially over the last 60 years or so. I think the standard we've kind of all come down on, they're probably some group that are affiliated with or connected to the Essenes. We can't say there's necessarily a one-to-one correlation. There were a lot of theories about initially why were the scrolls there. Some people were like, oh, maybe fall of Jerusalem. They were fleeing to Masada and they just dumped all their texts at Qumran. And now we think, no, we have a community that was living at Qumran, living in the settlement nearby. We found a scriptorium, a place where clearly they were writing these texts. We found inkwells and whatnot. And clearly the texts were stored in the cave, perhaps like a Geniza, right? Like, oh, these are texts that we are no longer using. Instead of burying them, we put them in the caves. This is one theory. And it might explain why we have such a weird collection of texts in these caves.
Sure.
So they're probably the Essenes. We have sources like Josephus who talks about the Essenes. What he says doesn't always necessarily map onto what the texts themselves that we found at Qumran say about the Essenes. It seems like this community had two different strains. Like on the one hand, there was a group that lived throughout ancient Israel, Judea, lived in the cities and towns, and they had families and whatnot. And then we have another group that is living perhaps a monastic life, an inner group, so to speak, who are learning more esoteric texts. They're the ones there's 200 or so of them probably that are living at Qumran and producing their own texts that reflect their own religious community, their own religious movement. So you can think of the Essenes kind of like they're another strain of early Judaism, right? We have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we have the Zealots, and then we have this Essene group that seems to be connected and mapped on to the people who wrote the scrolls for a lot of reasons, though. They're super interested in ritual purity. They're super interested in the end of days. They are super interested in living communally and living collectively, like they share everything. So you join the movement, you give up your property, you give up your goods, you donate it to the community. And they are very suspicious of the Second Temple. They think that the Second Temple is illegitimate. They seem to have a running beef with the Hasmonean high priests and then the priests after them, that they're running the temple improperly. The temple has become impure. They're not interpreting the Torah correctly. So their strains of division seem to be, they're not interpreting the Torah correctly. They're not running the temple correctly. And also they're keeping the wrong calendar because the Qumranites kept a solar calendar, right? So they had a different calendar. So these seem to be the main theological conflicts between the Jerusalem high priesthood and the Jerusalem elites, and then those who are living at Qumran. So those are sort of, they've retreated to the desert to do their own thing, wait for the end of days, to keep themselves pure, so then prepared so that they can fight with the Messiah to redeem Israel. Seems to be what they're doing out there in the desert.
So as weird as that sounds, you know, and maybe who hasn't read Flusser and some of these other guys, but just the way that just some of the language that you use there, it's very New Testament also. Like the early believers would pool their resources, and there was also maybe not so much talk of ritual purity, but certainly like moral purity, sexual purity. These kind of things were very important to Paul. You see it come up again and again, and it's seems like a similar idea. Like Jesus is going to come back anytime. You've got to be ready, and so you have to keep yourself spotless, right? So that you can be part of the whatever the end times scenario is that Paul seemed to think was imminent. Are these just superficial similarities, or is there an intersection of Dead Sea Scrolls type of language and theology with like the Book of Revelation and all this kind of stuff that we find in the New Testament?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a question that has bothered scholars for a while. Some early theories were, and I'm actually not totally opposed to this idea that John the Baptist might have been an Essene. And the reasons people would say that, he's an ascetic. He likes to live out in the desert, so do the Qumranites, right? He's really interested in mikvah and mikvot, right? So he seems interested in ritual purity. And in fact, the Qumranites are interested in ritual purity, but they're also using mikvot as a sort of part of their initiation into the community. So perhaps there's some overlaps there. Perhaps John the Baptist was familiar with the Essene movement. Perhaps he was an Essene. There's no way to know. So there might be some intersection there. More broadly, I think what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Qumran literature, and the Qumran literature I like to use to refer to the stuff that was written by the Qumran sect, right?
Right.
Seems to be, on the one hand, very particular to this religious movement, very particular to their own theological ideas. On the other hand, it also reflects broader Second Temple zeitgeist, right? Broader Second Temple ideas. There was in Second Temple literature, and we can see this from texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not written by the Qumran community, like, as I mentioned, the Book of Enoch, right? Which is also expecting one like the Son of Man to come, right? That there to be this end of the world judgment, and the righteous and the wicked would, meet their due, so to speak. So we see this apocalyptic expectations that was in the air for a lot of Second Temple Jews. We don't know if it's for everybody, but it seems to be a lot of people, including the Jewish writers of the New Testament, who are also participating in this apocalyptic mentality. And it makes sense, right? If you believe the end of the world is going to happen any day now, and you're looking to the Torah and you're looking to apocalyptic literature like the Book of Daniel and perhaps the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch seems to have had pseudo-scriptural status for both the Qumran community and even some of the writers of the New Testament who seem to
they loved it.
seem to be familiar with the Book of Enoch, right? and other texts, perhaps like Jubilees, that you might develop very similar notions about what you should do to prepare for the end of the world, right? It means maybe not focusing on the things of this life. Maybe it means being ascetic, right? Because we already see ideas in the Torah about, if you're going to go into holy war, you should avoid sexual impurity, right? So this is an idea that you could see how for both the Qumranites and for writers of the New Testament, including the book of Revelation, this becomes a way to think about what should you do in the present to get prepared for the end of the world, which is viewed as sort of a holy war, right? A holy war. And also you see also common ideas about the Messiah, right? We have lots of different kinds of theological ideas about the Messiah. Even within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have like a priestly Messiah expectations, a Davidic Messiah expectations. We have this figure called an angel of light, right? What is this, a human? Is this just an angel, right? So within that mix, you can also throw the early Jesus movement, right? And so some of their ideas about Jesus map onto some ideas that we see at Qumran, like in the book of Hebrews, right? We have this idea of this priestly sort of Messiah, and that's not far-fetched because we have other Jewish communities that are also thinking in terms of a priestly Messiah. Perhaps in some ways responding to this memory of the Hasmoneans, right? This last Jewish monarchy who came into power after the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids. And they set themselves up as both kings and high priests. They weren't of the Davidic monarchy, but they were Levites, right? But they weren't necessarily the Levites that could become priests. So they set themselves up as kings and high priests and upset a lot of people. So in some ways, you could see Qumran, and scholars think this is true, are responding to this. No, if we have this Messiah who will come, he will be a legitimate Messiah. He will also be a legitimate priestly Messiah. And in some ways, you can see the book of Hebrews and other texts participating in this conversation. What might it look like to have a real legitimate Messiah who is priestly and Davidic and all of these things? So they're having, maybe not talking to each other, all of that to say, maybe the Qumranites and the followers of Jesus are not talking to each other. We can't say that they weren't. But we can't say that they were. But they are participating in a conversation that's happening all around them, that's in the air in this period of late Second Temple Judaism. So that's how I would answer that question.
Wow. Hey, just wanted to take a second here to remind you that when you like, comment, and subscribe, YouTube is more likely to recommend this video to other people. The more the channel grows, the more of a platform we'll have to be able to invite spectacular guests, giving you the opportunity to hear how the Jewish Jesus is changing lives across the globe. So please smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. These small steps have a big effect in spreading the message of the Jewish Jesus and his kingdom to as large an audience as possible. You know, I saw you at the Enoch seminar. So a bunch of people presented papers basically about books of the Bible being read as Jewish literature. Like the authors of these texts would have situated themselves within Judaism, even if maybe that terminology wasn't necessarily exactly what was available to them. But they would have thought of themselves that way. Like they're doing Judaism, they're Jewish. That's right. It's not a new religion. Jesus didn't come to start a new religion. Of course, that's not a new idea, but there still seems to be a lot of exploration to do when it comes to reading New Testament texts within Judaism. I have Runison and Gertner's compilation of Matthew within Judaism articles on my desk right now. I'm still going through it. But one of the days was Revelation, right? We have Revelation within Judaism, and there was a broad agreement among all of the very bright people present that it's one of the more Jewish-looking books of the New Testament. What we're going through end of days. We're starting really soon. This is evergreen content, but if you're listening to this when it comes out in 2025, we've already started, but we haven't gotten to Revelation yet. We're gonna do a Messianic Jewish perspective on Revelation for like the last, however big the fraction is, the last 20% or 25% of the year. I'm interested to hear you talk about Revelation from what you know from your study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Who are the Revelation people? Why did somebody write this?
Yeah.
And what were they hoping to accomplish by writing it?
Yeah. Revelation is really interesting. So yes, there was a broad consensus by my fellow panelists. But the thing is, beyond my fellow panelists, there's not a broad consensus. And in some ways, I like to think of Revelation as one of these texts that's sort of the frontier of the New Testament within Judaism. Because everybody agrees Jesus was Jewish. We've been there. We've done that. Most people agree. Paul was Jewish. Now, what the implications of that are, right? Like whether we should situate him more within like his Greco-Roman context or whether he's all these questions people are still debating, but they will say, Paul was Jewish. So therefore we could make the case his letters are Jewish literature. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the book of Revelation, there's a lot of pushback for thinking about it as a Jewish text. My personal theory is that Revelation scholarship, for the most part, has been led by Christians. And there is this sense that the book of Revelation is the universal text. It is the text about the end of the world, about the bringing in of the Gentiles to become, right, all the Christians are victorious, right? This is a text that's not really about Jews. This is a text out of all the texts that we can say is about the mixed multitude, right? So I think there's a hesitation to read Revelation within Judaism because then it opens up a whole can of worms of like, what are the place of the Gentiles, right? And John, the author of Revelation, is not unconcerned with Gentiles. They're just not his primary concern, which I think can make some readers of the New Testament a bit uncomfortable because that's the story we've been telling ourselves about Revelation for several thousand years, right? So who wrote the book of Revelation? Well, his name is John. And this is really interesting because we have the Pauline literature where we know Paul wrote it. Paul says he wrote it. And this is actually a pretty new phenomenon in ancient literature. We don't have a whole lot of authored texts where we know who the author is and they tell us. And we can say, actually, this was the author and not sort of someone writing under the name of somebody. So the book of Enoch, for instance, was not written by Enoch, right? It wasn't written by this guy named Enoch who lived during the time of the flood. It was written by somebody in the Second Temple period using the name of Enoch to make a theological point, right? Mm-hmm. And in Second Temple Judaism, this is a very common literary style. Nobody squinted at this and were like, they're lying, because it was just a literary device and everybody kind of knew that was what you did, right? Book of Revelation is not pseudonymous. It's not written in the name of somebody, right? This is not someone claiming to be John the Apostle. He doesn't claim to be John the Apostle. He's just John, a very common Second Temple Jewish name. What he does tell us about himself is that he was exiled to Patmos because of his witness to Jesus. So we know from that there seemed to be some turbulence already in the end of the first century for people who were part of the Jewish Jesus movement, who were identifying Jesus as a Messiah in some sense. We don't know who was persecuting him. Was it other communities, other religious communities? More likely than not, it's probably the Romans. So we know this about him. We know that he is a Jewish author. His Greek is notoriously bad, possibly because it's not his first language, right? He's not a Hellenistic Jew, perhaps like Josephus and Philo, for whom writing in Greek was second nature, right? Clearly, this is not second nature for him. What else do we know about John? Well, we know that he seems to have a beef with Paul. He seems to disagree, at least with how Paul had been interpreted. So this is a couple of decades after Paul is writing his letters. Most scholars date the book of Revelation to the end of the first century, perhaps in the 80s or 90s. There's some people who might date the book of Revelation to right at the time of the fall of the Second Temple. There's no way to know, but either way, the book of Revelation is written in the last half of the first century. So within living memory of the fall of the temple. And John is grappling with a couple of issues. He's grappling with the fall of the temple, perhaps the enslavement of much of the Judean population. Perhaps the Romans are looking more carefully at the diasporic Jewish communities to make sure that nothing suspicious is happening, or at the very least, their fellow Roman citizens, members of the Roman Empire, are also looking at them like, what are you doing, right? So they're under a lot of social pressure. Perhaps added taxation. There's some debate about this. They're also just the trauma of the loss of the first temple. And then finally, John is grappling with Jewish movement debates about what does it mean to follow Jesus. So for those communities in Asia Minor, and Paul actually planted, and his followers planted a lot of those communities, you have John coming in and sort of a couple decades later wrestling with communities that are saying, you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. You don't need to worry about sexual impurity. It's all fine. And John's like, wait, hold up. I disagree. That is definitely not what you should be doing. And in fact, in chapter 2, verse 9, and in chapter 3, verse 9, he talks about those who say they are Jews, eudaioi, and are not. And traditionally, this verse has been explained as, John is talking about Jewish communities that are persecuting him. But no, he says those who say they are Jews and are not. A straightforward reading is he's talking about people who are claiming to be Jewish and are not actually Jewish. So he's participating in some of the fallout of people taking Paul and reading him in particular ways that John disagrees with, right? So John seems to be writing
that happening.
Yes, right. Who would ever have thought, right? Paul is not difficult to understand whatsoever. So John clearly doesn't seem to be a fan of some of the implications of Paul's letters that these communities have taken. And from this address, we can assume that John is writing to those he thinks can claim to be eudaioi, those who say they are eudaioi and are not lying, right? And for these communities, he is writing the book of Revelation. So we should imagine them as Jewish diasporic communities living in Asia Minor, mostly that's modern day Turkey, right? They're living in Asia Minor, and they too, like John, are grappling with this trauma of the loss of the temple, the loss of Judea, right, of Roman oppression. Perhaps socially, they're under a lot of new pressures that they hadn't been under before. Perhaps they have an influx of refugees coming from Judea. We're not sure. And family members who had been enslaved and sent who knows where, right? So they're dealing with a lot of trauma. And on top of that, they're dealing with these interreligious pressures. Like we have other people who are part of the Jesus movement who are perhaps claiming their Jewish identity, but then not keeping Torah, perhaps eating meat sacrificed to idol, doing things that are creating these tensions in this budding early Jesus movement. So this is the context for writing the book of Revelation. On the one hand, addressing these religious concerns. And on the other hand, a consolation of sorts for a community that is grappling with the trauma of the loss of the temple and the loss of the state of Israel, Judea.
Wow. And there's still no temple, but a few things have changed. Wow.
Yeah, still no temple. But John has an answer for that, which is, it's fine. We have the heavenly temple, and this is one of those moments where the Qumran literature and the early Jesus movement oftentimes, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not, come to the same sort of conclusion. So for the Qumran community, their answer to a temple that is impure, a temple that is run by a corrupt priesthood, is that it's fine. There's a heavenly temple, or there will be a better heavenly temple, kind of like Ezekiel imagined, right? And they have lots of texts that are devoted to thinking about and imagining this temple. And then we have the book of Revelation, and that is John's answer to the absence of the temple. It's fine. The temple is running per usual. It's just in the heavens. And it's a better temple. It's a more powerful temple. It's a temple that can't be touched by the Roman emperor because God is the cosmic emperor, and his temple continues to run. The priests are the angels are the priests in this temple, right? So this is one part of John's answer to the loss of the temple.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the very end, right? So you don't need a temple here. You don't need, because like everything is sort of a, the temple, the way that I think of it, it's like, well, you need that because you need all of that stuff because God, if you go too close to him, you'll explode or something, right? Like, or fire will come. Like that's the reason you have to have all these,
right,
this purity things and all of the sacrifices and stuff, they're accomplishing something that allows God to dwell in that place. Well, and you don't need that in the new heavens and the new earth, like New Jerusalem comes down out of the sky, like the bride adorned for her husband. There's you don't need the sun anymore. Also, you don't need the sun anymore, I think.
Yeah.
You don't need a temple anymore.
Yeah.
But
Well, the sun had been destroyed by that point, according to the narrative of Revelation. But yes.
yeah, but he didn't need to make another one.
Yeah, I think even thinking about this New Jerusalem, the text says you don't need a temple anymore, but it is effectively, New Jerusalem is a temple. It is a city that is holy. In fact, the text actually says nothing impure can come in, right? Unsanctified, impure things have to stay outside of the city gate, including also things like people. There's nothing murderous, nothing like all of those things that we think of as moral impurity also have to stay outside of the gate as well. So the city itself, the entire city is holy. And this too isn't an unusual Second Temple Jewish idea, right? We have a text called from Qumran, the Temple Scroll, which is unusual in imagining a Jerusalem, the entire city is a temple, right? The entire city up to the edges of the walls has become a temple. And therefore all the things about entering and leaving the temple now apply to the city. The city is a temple city. And so you see a very similar idea at the end of Revelation where in the eschaton, yes, you won't have this one little temple. The whole city, and this is an enormous city in the imagination of John, is a temple. And still, even in the end of days, even in the eschaton, nothing impure should come in, nothing unholy, nothing sinful should come into the grounds of this temple city. And
isn't there a verse in Zechariah somewhere back there that says every pot in the city will be holy to the Lord?
Right, and this is that idea, right?
Similar idea.
Similar idea. And then the other thing I would say is one of the things that actually got me initially interested in the book of Revelation and looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls is, yes, there are no sacrifices necessarily happening unless you count the martyrs, right? But there are prayers, right? Prayer is the main thing that is happening in the book of Revelation. What are they offering as sacrifices on the heavenly altar? It's the prayers of the righteous, right? And you see this also at Qumran, like prayer. I talked about this early text that got me interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Shirot, the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice. It's the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, right? The liturgy itself becomes, on the one hand, a means for those who are reading the text to imaginatively enter the heavenly temple. And on the other hand, the prayers themselves become a sacrifice because angels are offering this liturgical sacrifice and humans along with them are offering this liturgical sacrifice. So for the minds of the Qumran writers and also John as well, prayer is this really amazing thing that bridges space and time. It allows human beings to become like the angels. It allows human beings to become priests, even if they are not priests, right? Prayer is this super powerful thing. And this is a shared idea both at Qumran and I think for the author of Revelation.
Well, you find these ideas in rabbinic literature too, quite often, quite all the way through there. Well, I hope everyone listening to this was listening to that, and we'll go pray today. Don't forget to pray, everybody.
Don't forget to pray.
It's good for you. So we have a little time left, and I wanted to talk about at least one of your other areas of study and interest, which is you have a podcast called The Women Who Went Before.
You do.
I think it's womenwhowentbefore.com, isn't it?
Well, that's the website. You can go to it, and we have all our episodes available there with transcripts and whatnot.
So tell me about Women Who Went Before.
Yeah, so Women Who Went Before is a podcast about women in the ancient Mediterranean. A lot of our podcast episodes involve texts from early Christianity or early Judaism, but not just that. We'll also look at the classical period. And the question that sort of drives the podcast is, a lot of our ancient literature is written by men. Mostly because men are the ones who were literate, and women oftentimes were not. And so the texts that were written by women, although we have examples of them, are few and far between. And so accessing what were their lives like, what were they doing is really difficult. So how do we approach this? How can we sort of reconstruct the lives of ancient women? How can we find out what ancient Jewish women were doing, how they were practicing nidah. How can we find out what ancient Christian women were doing, right? How involved were they in the early church? And the Christian case is actually very interesting because we have, like, for instance, the Nag Hammadi texts, right, that were discovered in Egypt. These are some of our earliest attestations to Christian literature. Most of it did not make it into the New Testament, but this is another strain of early Christianity, very Gnostic, very sort of speculative. You could kind of think of it like Jewish mysticism, but just the Christian version, right? And they have a lot of texts written by women or about women. And even within the New Testament, we have glimpses of how women were involved in the early Jesus movement, like Junia, who Paul talks about, right? This female apostle. So trying to reconstruct and resurrect what might their lives have been like, especially since we oftentimes don't have their voices, is kind of the project of the podcast. So yes, so that's kind of what the podcast is about, and it's been a lot of fun. It wasn't my area of expertise, but I thought, I'll pick up a COVID hobby, and that was what it was.
A COVID hobby, wow.
A COVID hobby. I was like, you know what I should do during COVID? I should start a podcast. It's not going to be a whole lot of work. Just be something fun to do on the weekends. But I soon discovered that is not true. Podcasts are a lot of work, a lot of fun, but a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah. I only have to do the fun part. We have experts to do all the editing and even the booking. And like, I just get to sit here and talk to interesting people. Often I will get their books for free. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm telling you, it's a sweet gig. It's a sweet gig, Dr. Haigh.
It is.
You're out there.
It's nice to be on the other side, just showing up for the interview. Yeah.
Whereas you're like meticulously editing and cutting out things.
Yeah. It's come to the point where when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm like, I can hear breathing. This is an issue. So it sort of ruined my own podcast listening experience. But yes. But yeah, it has been a lot of fun.
You have to breathe.
You do have to breathe, unfortunately, even when you are on air.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. But the podcast itself was a lot of fun for me. It reminded me, and this is true for anyone, whether you're in academia or not, it can be very fun to learn about things that you don't know anything about, just to jump into the deep end. You know, I would often find myself doing things like reading about ancient Egypt and their papyrus on medicine, not something I would normally pick up on a Thursday, but it was really fun and really informative. And I think the key to creativity and the key to just spending time enjoying your life, a life of learning, is to always jump into something new, right? To always have something that's outside of your comfort zone that you were reading about, that you were engaging. And that was one major positive of the podcast. And then the other thing is, and this is true of us, of those who are reading the Bible, to always remember and think about the marginal voices, the voices that don't always get heard. Sometimes that's women, right, who are participating in the creation of this literature, but whose names don't end up on the pages. Sometimes it's enslaved people, right? We actually think there's a book by Candida Moss who talks about the ghostwriters of the New Testament, talks about how there may have been a lot of enslaved labor who actually contributed in some ways to the production of some of our New Testament texts because they were the scribes, right? And thinking about the people who told these stories orally, right? Who transmitted them from person to person, but whose fingertips, you know, we can only imagine, we can't actually access how they contributed to these texts. And so I think it's always an important reminder to think about the people who did participate in creating this literature, who maybe shaped it in some way, but whose names ultimately did not end up being attached to these texts. And even though we can never access them, it's important to recognize that they had a hand in these texts.
Yeah. It's easy to get the idea that, where are the women? Well, they were doing something else. Because we don't see them. Because we don't see them having, like you said, having their name as the in the author slot on these texts. But they are. You know, there's having been in church my whole life, the women are doing most of the real work in churches. Like there's, but it is like often just not the most visible or the most. They're not in the spotlight. But women should not be discouraged by that. They should go do things.
Go do
So
things.
it's
Start a
good. I'm
podcast.
glad.
No, don't start a podcast.
Women-
I don't recommend.
Women go do things. Speaking of that, how did you get to the point where it was like you had to take it this far? I mean, you've taken it all the way. You've got a PhD, and you're still writing, right? Contributing papers and things. Like, when did you know that this was going to be what you did with your life, and not the poodle thing?
Not the poodle thing. I think at the end of my undergraduate degree, I was like, what should I do next? And at that point, I had just done a degree of things I was interested in. And I was actually, I can once again blame my father and grandfather for this. So usually my sense back in the, early 2000s is that the advice for aspiring millennial college goers was do something that will make you money. Right. Do something that will make you money. And both my father and my grandfather were like, no, absolutely not. Do something that sparks joy. Do something that you are really interested in. Don't worry about the money, right? Like don't trap yourself in a career that you hate. So I took that advice and I was like, well, I really like reading and writing and reading ancient texts and thinking about them and then talking about them to other people. So I took the maybe not necessarily a great paycheck sort of career choice, but I just decided to go into academia. And yeah, so their advice really shaped what career choices I took. I could have been a lawyer. I did think about that for a hot minute, but I decided that I really liked talking and reading about ancient texts. So this is what I did.
Well, we may have some younger people watching. I know you're watching younger people. I know your Camp Saudi people are watching this. Maybe some of you are looking, some of the girls and boys from Camp Saudi are looking at your journey and thinking, I also love reading ancient texts and talking about them with other people. And for those who are considering such a path, but maybe thinking like, well, a lot of people who go on and on with their education, somewhere along the line, they decide that God is not real anymore, or they become cynical or overwhelmed by different pieces of information, and it just makes it look like, well, this wasn't what I grew up learning, and it's hard to integrate all of it. And along the way, sometimes they might lose their faith. Do you have any caveats or encouraging words for those who might be watching who are also thinking, maybe I'll get a PhD someday?
Well, my advice would be, despite me saying, do what you're interested in and passionate about, which I think is great advice. When it comes to academia, I would say right now might not be the moment. Academia it's not doing great. Despite as much as I love it and, I am really happy with my choices. It's not doing great. With that caveat in mind, to answer your question.
Pull the ladder up, Dr.
Yeah,
Haigh.
pull the ladder up. With that caveat in mind, and even just outside of going into academia, I think if you go to school, I'm a huge fan of a liberal arts education. I'm a huge fan of taking religion and Bible classes in college, even if that's all that you do. Don't be afraid to do that. I think it is really important, whether you are religious or not religious, that you learn to grapple with the opinions and perspectives of people who are not like you. Because if you isolate yourself in a bubble and you never learn to debate, you never learn to think, you never learn to question, then your faith is very, very, if you have a faith, it is very, very fragile. So I think the fragility comes from not exercising, not reading, and not thinking for yourself and engaging people who have a different perspective from you. And I think you should be open to challenge. You should be open to change. I have changed a lot. I have evolved as a person. I've evolved as the way I think about the Bible, the way I think about my faith, over the course of, the last decade or so. And that happens. But it can only happen if you are open to other people's perspectives, if you're open to questioning. I think we should all be like Job. Job is this hero of mine in many ways because he's constantly poking at God, at the concept of God, poking at all of these things and questioning, and he never really gets answers, but God isn't upset with him, right? And so I think that is, if you are religious, you should be like Job. I think he's a hero in many ways for the questioning open mind. And so don't be afraid to do that, because in the long run, it probably will actually strengthen your own commitments, rather than making them more fragile. We should never be stagnant. We should always be on a path and always be on a journey of self-discovery and questioning and growth. And once you stop, that's where it gets dangerous, when you freeze. So that would be my advice.
Wise words, Dr. Haigh. Finally, and this is, some people on the team wondered about this, on the teaching team, because there's one thing I've noticed is that over the past couple of years, suddenly a bunch of people who couldn't write to save their lives are now competent writers due to the advent of large language models who just do that for you. But then I was looking at about how people were trying to use it to write briefs, like legal briefs, and it was just making things up. It sounded good. It sounded like the right thing, but it was citing cases that didn't exist. I sort of wondered, are people using this in the academy, and how do you find and arrest those people? Or do you think that it is useful? Like, have you found a use for it? I feel like if it's making things up, I don't want to make a mistake, but is there a use for this? It seems like everyone's talking about and using it.
Yeah, I don't know that we'll be able to escape AI. And I've come to the conclusion that my students are allowed to use it with caveats, because otherwise they're just going to use it. Although I do encourage them not to use it. And the reason being that I think writing is it is a way for us we write to think. Most people do write to think, right? And so if you're asking AI to write for you, they're doing your thinking for you as well. And also you lose if you were to use AI to write a lot of things, you will see that there's only like 5 or 6 adjectives it's probably going to suggest, right? It's very generic. It loses the flavor. It loses your voice gets lost. And so I don't really want to live in a world where we've lost all of our voices and we all just sound the same and we think the same, because we're not thinking. It's AI thinking for us. There can be some places where it's really useful. Maybe checking. I would like to see less grammar errors. So maybe if you're using it for that, okay, fine. But I do think that we don't want to lose our individuality. We don't want to lose our voice, and we don't want to stop thinking beyond just thinking about the environmental impact and the communal impact that these large centers are having across, America, but I'm sure across the world as well. In terms of like energy usage and the impact on people's bills and all the other implications of just putting in a simple inquiry when you could be thinking for yourself. So that's something to think about as well. That's my hot take on. I don't think it's going anywhere, unfortunately. But I do think that we should be cautious and use it with caveats.
It really has inspired me to be more weird. And at least attempt some degree of originality in my writing. Because I would look at things that I had just like, got to write something about this, got to write 1,000 words about this, like just hammer it out. And it was like, oh, this machine can basically do that. So if I want to create some, now when I sit down to write, I always think of myself as creating art. I know that probably sounds pretentious. But I feel like that's the only play now. If you want to have your own voice, you want to distinguish yourself from, because it is a competent writer. I mean, it doesn't. Yeah, it's for perfectly legible, like readable, sensible things. I follow
some writers, some creative writers who offer tips for how to write more originally. And a lot of the things they suggest are things that you simply cannot do with AI. It's like, go watch a sunset, go sit on a mountain and just have a book with like, what are like just gut reaction words? How do I encapsulate this moment in writing in ways that only we as humans can attempt to do? Because like you said, it is art. It is a way to express a moment, to express a viewpoint, and to share that with other people. And I think like actively trying to find ways to inject that into your own writing in whatever way that you're doing writing is, I think, a really great thing, and something that only we as humans can do, right?
Keep humanity human.
Keep humanity human.
All right. Well, we've plugged your podcast. Is there if someone out there wants to follow you on Twitter or something, do you have, how can people keep track of your illustrious career?
You can follow me on Twitter. You can also follow my podcast on Twitter. Women Before, I think is the Twitter handle for that. And then you can find me through that Twitter handle as well. Or X, I should say. So follow me on X and it'd be great. Cool. Are you going to be presenting, as of this recording, there's Enoch Seminar Part 2 is coming up. It will be long gone by the time we publish, but are you going to be attending or presenting or just lurking? I will be attending in between my classes. I will not be presenting, but yes, I will be around in the Zoom sphere. That is for sure. Well, thanks for telling us about the Dead Sea Scrolls today and about the things that you're passionate about. Again, if you're listening to this on the day it was published, it's not too late. Torah Club End of Days, we are going to tell you what's in there in Revelation and what you can do about it. So take a look at that. Go start a club or join a club. It's not too late. It's not too late, even though it's already started. The end of the world has not happened yet. It is not too late. It's not too late. If you can listen to this, then it hasn't happened yet. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Rebekah Haigh. Thank you so much for having me. Well, thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review along with a 5-star rating. If you want to learn more about the Jewish Jesus, create a free account at ffoz.org and start studying the scriptures from a Messianic Jewish perspective. We'll even give you a free book. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who partner in our mission to reconcile disciples of Yeshua with God's prophetic promises to Israel. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom. Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee. Let his word cover you.